So you notice that there was an optional reading from Gorman. This was kind of basically outlining what skill set should you have walked away with from your New Testament 1 class. I just want to offer a quick refresher. So you do not have to take New Testament 1 to take this class. You can take it out of sequence. But if you are taking New Testament 2 before New Testament 1, there are a couple of things that you should know about how we approach the text as kind of a biblical studies discipline, what the methodology is. And Gorman gives a nice summary of that. So like New Testament 1 in a nutshell, in terms of what skills, New Testament 1 is most about content, but there is a skill set you walk away with New Testament 1, and this is it. So what you learn in New Testament 1 is that history is important. And to know the history of the text, in the text, and behind the text is part of our process of interpreting the text. So the task of New Testament exegesis and historical critical method is about, in a nutshell, finding what the original author says to his or her original audience, finding the original message of the original author to the original audience, original message, original author to the original audience. In other words, when Matthew wrote his gospel, there's a community that received that gospel. How did they hear Matthew's gospel as the first readers, or the first people to have received it? And they were part of the same world in which the New Testament was written. So that's the task what the historical critical method and exegesis does. And now this first part, I put a little bit of a disclaimer at the bottom, so don't stress out for those of you who don't know Greek. But for those of you who do, part of what we do in terms of interpreting the text is we're encouraged to look at the original Greek text, translate the text, ask if there's any textual critical issues that affect the meaning of the text. There's a lot of text critical issues that do not affect the meaning of the text at all. It's just kind of nice knowledge to have about how they debated what the text might be. But if it actually affects the meaning of the text, you might want to know what that issue is. It's important to know the syntax and grammar, what individual words mean, how often those words occur in the Bible or New Testament. So that's what a concordance does. Sometimes laying out the structure of the sentence might help show the flow of the argument, especially if Paul in Ephesians 1 or disciple Paul, depending on who you think the author is, by the time you get to verse 18, you realize it's still one sentence. Maybe diagramming the sentence out might actually help in terms of not just interpreting the text, but also preaching from it. But now, if you don't know Greek, that's all right, because steps A and D can be done indirectly through looking at more than one English translation, so that where the English translations differ, that's probably an issue of the translators are arguing what the text is saying, and where the English translations are relatively the same, that's probably where there's a large majority agreement on how the text is translated. And you can get this from the commentaries, and also you're going to get some of this in our class. So in this class, I'll introduce some important keywords that even if you never take Greek while you're at seminary, you should know what these words are because they have such theological importance in our understanding in the New Testament. So a very easy one. Everyone knows what agape is, which is what love. Now, whether they know what it means to the story, I think it's been too commercialized what agape means. But there's words like dikaiosune theou, the righteousness of God, and those there will be some key Greek words that even though you don't know Greek, you haven't taken a Greek class, you should know, because when you open up tools of Bible study, like a commentary, they'll discuss these words, and it'll just be helpful for you to know what they are. So logos is another one that already people know, the word. So that's the part where the Greek original languages are involved. Everyone can do this though, is study the history in the text. What I mean by in the text is, if Jesus encounters the Pharisees, it helps. Who are the Pharisees? What kind of Jewish party were they? What does it mean that they were a table of fellowship sect according to Josephus? Why is it that they're so hung up on the temple and practicing the laws that are reserved for only priests, but have everyday people, non-priests, non-Levites, practice the laws surrounding the table or the altar of God? Isn't it weird that the Pharisees were a part defined by table fellowship, in the sense that everything you do in the temple on the altar of God is reduplicated and re-dramatized in the dinner table at home, because they're trying to bring the temple to the people. So knowing that might help us understand Jesus's debate on where the presence of God is, where God, whether the temple is something that has been so corrupt that God no longer resides there. So that's the history in the text. You read about the Samaritan woman. Well, why does it matter that she's a Samaritan and a woman? And why is it scandalous that Jesus would talk to her in public the way she did in John chapter 4? All these things. This is an Old Testament text quoted in our text. Why is it quoted where? So this is all about understanding the Jewish context or the Greco-Roman context of the wider world. This is the history in the text that helps us understand what we read. But there's also history behind the text. You did a lot of that. In other words, what's the history of the author? What does it matter that Paul was in prison when he wrote a certain number of his letters, and he wasn't? He was riding high on the missionary circuit when he wrote other letters. So this is the history behind the text. Behind the text is Paul and the Galatians, and this huge argument that exploded in Galatia about when certain members of Jerusalem visited. And at first they were eating with the Gentiles, non-kosher food. They stepped away from the table, and Paul stood up and he confronted Peter and the delegates from Jerusalem. It's this big scene. There's a history behind the text that the text itself refers to. And so this is what we call historical criticism. So we have historical studies, historical criticism. There's also the literary context. We don't want to just study one verse in isolation. We want to study the verses around the text, what we call the pericope. The pericope is the smallest unit of context for any single verse. This is called the pericope. And then we also might want to know what's happened by the chapter, the whole book, that kind of thing. And then when you put it all together, we're not satisfied with just trying to hear what the message said, what the original message was by the original author to the original audience, but we want to think theologically about the text, and we want to interpret the text today. So it does matter that we think theologically or apply the text to today's context, and it does matter the spirituality of the reader. I think one of the things that Gorman and other New Testament scholars have noted is that it matters whether you're a person in the faith. If it's a lens through which we read scripture, and we read scripture very differently from those who don't have the faith of Christ. They read it as an historical document, divorced from the intervention of God in human history. So this is what you would have learned in New Testament 1 in a nutshell. And if some of these points are rusty, the optional article for Gorman is there. Now, what's new in New Testament 2? Here we're doing synthesis as well as theological construction. In other words, rather than doing a book by book study, this is Matthew's theology. This is John's theology. This is the theology of the letter of Galatians, etc. We're trying to systematize and put this all together. We read the Bible in its occasion form historically, but we put that all together and we think, okay, so Paul has the Christ hymn that Jesus emptied himself. John uses completely different language to describe the incarnation. He says that the word became flesh and he tabernacled among us. So is what John's saying about the incarnation and what Paul's saying about Jesus emptied himself when he became a man, even to the point when he died on the cross. Are they speaking to each other? Are they saying two different things? New Testament theology takes the sum of what the New Testament witness is and brings a coherent message. So if I really want to understand incarnation, I can't just study Philippians 2 or even just what Paul says about it. I have to study what every New Testament author says about it, especially the writer of Hebrews, who has one of the most robust and highest Christologies and yet maintains Jesus learned obedience through his suffering. So you have the height and the descent, both the descent and the height of Jesus, his highest Christological divine claim, and also being fully human. at the same time. So if you throw out any part of the New Testament, you will get an incomplete picture to the witness New Testament on who Jesus is, what it means to be a church, certain ethical challenges the church is facing in their day, and how that finds analogs in our day. So this is what we're doing in New Testament too. We're looking across the canon, and we're talking about how the New Testament as a corporate witness, as including the New Testament's reliance on the Old Testament to inform that witness. So we want to be Marcion about it. We want to say that, as you read in John Goldingay, despite the historical diversity of the authors and the genres of the Old Testament and New, and the time and temporal distance between them, we do have one story. We have one guy who unites that story. And so in many ways, New Testament theology is part of the process to contribute to uncovering what that one story is. So we're going to begin with what is New Testament theology. That there are a lot of New Testament theologies, and there's a lot of ways to do it. So this is why we had to ask this question first, what New Testament theology is, before we even started the course. And we're going to take a particular road, but I just wanted to let you know that whatever we do in this class, there are proponents for other ways of doing New Testament theology. And I'm just giving you a really like a big flash screen of all the people who have written on this topic, and they all say different things. So notice here's some of the problems. I'm just going to present some of the problems that people engaged in the process of New Testament theology are trying to solve, and that'll kind of give you a reason why Goldingay and also your reading of Van Hooser approach the problem the way they do, along with what Richard Hayes says in this really great essay, The Hermeneutics of Trust. So one of the biggest challenges is if you're going to do a New Testament theology, which text do you choose? I mean, for the study of any topic in the New Testament or any theme. And one of the problems we've experienced is the shortcomings of word studies. I think at the pastor level, this is probably what we call the biggest exegetical mistake that pastors make when they tackle a theme. So if they want to talk about the power of God, and they know a little bit of Greek, they might look up the English word power where it appears, or they might look up the particular word dunamis, which is the word for power, or to have power to do something. So it's more of like power to do something than having power over something. That's what dunamis means. What if I looked up every occurrence of the word power, access those texts, and then that's how I do New Testament theology, what power looks like, divine power? Well, the problem is that dunamis is not the only word for power. There's a word kratos, which is might. There is iskus, which is strength. There is bia, which is force. There are metaphors or metonymies for power. The armor of the Lord. Am I flexing? Okay, maybe I should flex. Not that impressive. But the armor of the Lord, that's a metaphor for power. Or Jesus says to those who doubted the divine origin of his demon exorcism, that Beelzebub cannot fight Beelzebub. Satan cannot fight Satan. If this is not from God, if this is from God, then the finger of God is upon you. And so there are metonymies and metaphors so you need to cover all that. If you do a single word study on the concept of power, it will give you partial insight into a theology of power, but ultimately it could be incomplete. And if the incomplete part, the missing part, is essential to our understanding of power, then it's a distorted theology. So New Testament scholars quickly learned that word studies alone can't do it. If you're going to do that, you have to look at the collection of words that make up what we call a semantic domain of power, including the metaphors and metonymies of it. Some have simply followed the doctrines of the church. In other words, well, I know what text to look at for Christology, because when I look at the Nicene Creed, for example, I notice that it refers to John 1, Psalm 2, Philippians 2, and Hebrews 1. And that's actually, I think that's actually a pretty good start. I think that the doctrines of the church do point us well to the parts of the New Testament that inform the doctrine. But it might be that the doctrines of the church leaves things out, don't consider certain things. Every author of a doctrine is susceptible to the blindness of their time period and things that they might have missed. So it would be helpful to enlarge the discussion and not limit ourselves to the creeds, although the creeds are an important guiding part of what we do. What about author approaches? Well, can I talk about what Jesus said with the historical Jesus and the Jesus of the Gospels and Paul, and then see what they all say together? Well, yeah, but whose historical reconstruction of Jesus are you rely on? The one that strips so much away of the Gospels of what Jesus did and accomplished that what you're left with is hardly a figure of a person, let alone the divine Son of God. Are you just going to focus on the Jesus of the Gospels theologically and ignore the historical Jesus? If we talk about Paul, are you going to separate Paul from Deutero-Paul? Do you think that Deutero-Paul is the author of the women in ministry and women in the household codes? And Paul was the great liberator. It was the Deutero-Paul that actually subjugated women with those prohibitions. There's a lot of questions on, and what about John? Did John just write the Gospel of John? Did he write the letters too? Which letters? Did he write the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation? So even author-based approaches have their problems because it's hard to define what the canon, what the author wrote. And then there's also the danger of Marcionism. The Old Testament is not the Hebrew Bible. I think your reading John Goldingay really emphasized that point. We do not read the Bible as our fellow Jewish brothers and sisters in the synagogue do. We do call it the Old or First Testament, which is the language that John Goldingay likes using, as a part of our scripture, and as a part, but not the complete whole of one story of God that includes the story of Jesus Christ and the chapters of the church that follow after Jesus. So whatever we do in New Testament theology, it should never be divorced from the Old Testament witness. In fact, if we do New Testament theology right, it is coherent, consistent, and threads itself well, even though there might be some tension points with what the Old Testament teaches, but it doesn't override or contradict what the Old Testament does. The New Testament witness has to be consistent with the Old, or you don't have one God, you have two. So those are the questions that people ask when we think about New Testament theology. And I gave you some reading, Goldingay and Van Hooser, to help us guide us through the discussion. And we're going to go through that.
So that concludes part 1 of this week's material for module 1. And so as you go into your reading to prepare for part 2, where we meet on Microsoft Teams or in person, please ask these questions that are on the screen. In your reading, be able to answer, how does Goldingay define biblical theology? Does it make a difference that we call the Torah, the prophets, and the writings the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament of Christian scriptures? What distinction does Goldingay make? In fact, he prefers actually the term First Testament rather than Old Testament. And on your module, we're going to also talk about the idea of inseparable operations, which I think is a better way than to try to read the Old Testament Christocentrically. We're going to read it Christotelically, although both are needed, but I put emphasis on a Christotelic reading of the canon. And as a corollary, there are places where we have a Christocentric reading of the canon. And we'll make a distinction on how to do that when we meet for class. The Van Hooser article is more complicated. He is trying to talk about the differences between biblical theology and systematic theology. And he doesn't really talk about New Testament theology, but his discussion on the differences between biblical theology and systematic theology enables us to come to a definition to what New Testament theology does as a bridge discipline between the two. So in your reading, do answer the question, how does Van Hooser define biblical theology and systematic theology? In fact, he gives a set of binaries that we'll go over in class, but you'll read about. And I'll just simply put it up here in PowerPoint form. And you'll need to be able to define these two disciplines as separate and distinct before we can go into the question of what is New Testament theology and how it bridges the two disciplines. And that concludes part 1 for module 1A of our session together.